All right, we have reached the top of the hour here. So want to welcome everyone to the Reliability in the West discussion series. I'm Travis English. I'm the Interim Manager of Communications here at WEC. We'll kick things off with our antitrust policy. All WEC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WEC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with policy and guidelines. This meeting is public. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in the open session. This webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WEC strives to ensure the information presented today is accurate and reflects the views of WEC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have any questions, please contact WEC's legal counsel. All right, well, with that, I want to welcome everyone to the discussion series. Today, we're taking a look at the summer outlook for summer 2024. Excited to have Sunny Westcott. She's the Chief Meteorologist for CISA and the Department of Homeland Security. So, Sunny, I'd like to turn it over to you to give us an update on summer 2024.
All right, I'll go ahead and pull up my screen so that you're all able to follow along with the presentation. We've got about 15 minutes, so I'm going to roll through it at my typical higher intensity pace. For those of you who saw my presentation last year, I want to make sure that on this slide, everyone highlights what we're starting at, which is the temperature margin is already well above the last couple of years on a global scale. So we're going to look at a drill down, not just from the global scale, but also to the national scale and then down to the regional scale called the mesofunnel. For those of you who follow along with weather forecasting. So what we're going to start with here is just an analysis of where we're at already this year. You'll see that we talked about abnormal warming, but not in the West. Our abnormal warming is actually in the Midwest right now, going into the Great Lakes. And what that means for the change in our weather pattern across the U.S. is that our lows are coming down from a different region. And with them, they're not bringing as nearly of cold of air as we're used to over here. So a lot of record-breaking temperatures and record-breaking lack of snowfall, more rainfall than usual, already falling across certain areas and basins that required it at the headwaters for different river systems especially. So watching things like the Mississippi, Missouri River system and the losses to hydroelectric, there are going to be a main concern for that region. But you can also see some of the different events that happened in March in the West. We saw different storm systems bringing snowfall amounts. So almost an exact swap of what we saw last year. And that's going to be what we continue to see as major threats, is these pendulum swings of intensity that are very hard to plan for. When you look at some of the different billion-dollar disasters, I know you guys have seen those graphics before. We've already had quite a few this year. All of them were severe weather-based. So for those in the West, looking at things like monsoon season to be more potent than usual, as well as our atmospheric river events when they do kick off, capable of bringing in a significant amount of moisture by the time in which they start to set in. These are all just different graphics to show you that the pain margin is going to be pretty widespread this year. Temperatures being record-breaking either in intensity or longevity or both across every continent so far already reported, as well as abnormally high rainfall amounts. We have abnormally high rainfall across various countries causing massive damage scales. You guys all, I'm sure, saw UAE's report. For those of you who don't know, the Middle East's climate most closely replicates parts of our desert Southwest. So any threat that they see from their climatological systems over inundating their area is a threat for our area as well. So when we look at case studies and applications of material types, it's important to annotate that these are developed areas that are taking damage this year and subsequently puts our infrastructure in that same threshold of concern. So when we talk about supply chain implications, for those of you who take damage this year, looking at competing globally for the same resources, it's going to be a major concern. And the fact that storms are stronger across the oceans means that there will be delays in supply chain. Higher temperatures also mean that there will be less capability to load things on the railways, on the aircraft, and with lower river systems on our barges as well. So you're going to see this is going to become a major cascading impact as we go forward. Looking at our outlooks for these years, for those of you who look at NOAA's products for the seasonal outputs, these get updated every month. So I highly recommend you check back. They'll update as the models update. Models are already indicating that in the next week, we're going to start to see a heat dome start to develop down in Mexico. That heat dome will bleed into the southern United States. That'll start to push all the way up and into Canada through the Great Lakes region. So you're going to see one half of the U.S. abnormally warm, well over 100 degrees across multiple states by mid-March. Towards the tail end of March is when the western half of the United States will start to make headlines with the heat dome. So we have some some time to look forward to the changes coming. The downside is our precipitation leading into summer just before monsoon season kicks off. We are expecting drought conditions in areas which have already burned historically and suffered from drought. The downside from these areas and these temperatures is that the winds are getting stronger. Many of you have already annotated this across your different transmission line systems, different red flag warnings, loss of humidity within these winds. These winds are drying winds. They're damaging. Subsequently, what we're seeing from that is a major threat to the soil moisture and vegetation out west. Our tree die-off rate, any trees which showed early signs of autumn, those are going to be at risk this year of either fire, decay, or fall. That's going to be a major concern across the west and into the Pacific Northwest, again, impacting transmission lines. We know that a good portion of transmission lines going down is due to tree branches. We also know that major flood events, when they push through these areas, will take the debris with them into the river systems, and that'll impact hydroelectric as well downstream. The more debris, the worse. Looking at our drought impacts, you'll see what we're expecting over the next couple of months. This will go through July. We are expecting for drought to worsen in areas where we're expecting for fire activity to increase, stronger winds to increase, more lightning strikes, less rain. We're expecting for that to push all the way up and into the Rockies. So areas which did not see enough snowfall, the northern half of the Rockies, highlighting that. That means that those areas are not going to see the increase in precipitation that they need in order to facilitate full hydro output this year again. Some of those areas were at a snowpack loss this year. We're going to see that's a major concern when it comes to being able to operate going into the tail end of the summer. Looking at the EDDI in that bottom left-hand corner, that's the thirst of the atmosphere. That's areas where the atmosphere will most likely suck up at a faster rate from the surface. You can see that different hydroelectric basins than last year are the main concern. We're going to watch the front range of the Rocky Mountains for major storm impacts from fire, and from lightning strikes from that. So we're going to continue to have to look at Hawaii as well. For any of you who have shared interest in Hawaii, they're already listed as a major threat on our fire maps going into the next couple of months. So you'll see here Hawaii is listed for May, June, and July, but so is the desert Southwest. You'll see that Arizona, New Mexico, Texas highlighted 2 months straight. New Mexico is going to be very persisting, but then the Pacific Northwest starts to join in. This is going to be a concern because, as you can see from the soil moisture drought indicator, various pockets which did not see the snowpack were already going to start to see soil drought. So this is a combined effect where snowpack runoff is not going to save them, and the amount of tree die-off in these areas is going to increase. So you'll see that area is starting to get flagged more and more often in fire weather concerns. Fire weather bringing higher levels of arsenic and mercury into the river systems, but also bringing with it drier soils for when the floods do come. They will scoop off that top layer of soil and dump it in the reservoir systems, thereby causing sedimentation and reducing the amount able to be held. Renewables at risk. For those of you who haven't seen the news recently, Texas took a major hailstorm to their solar field. We're going to continue to see these impacts. Last year, we saw it in Wisconsin. We've seen larger hail, more tornadic activity this year in April. So far, we've seen twice as many tornadoes as we have on average. We're over 400 for tornado reports just in April. To highlight some of these hail events, we've seen larger than grapefruit-sized hail, just like last year, falling at more than 150 miles per hour. That's capable of expansive damage. That's going to be a major concern this year. Hail that's the same size as it was 20 years ago is now heavier. It's forming faster. There's less air entrainment in it, which means the same size but more dense. That's going to fall faster. It's going to do more damage. That's going to be applicable not just to solar, but it's going to be applicable to wind as well. Transmission lines that are above ground are also at risk of damage from these larger hail pieces. Stronger straight line winds. I'm sure we've all noticed the winds are picking up and persisting. This also means that prescribed burns are likely to be delayed a lot longer this year. You're going to notice that subsidence in the West is going to be a headline news event, especially in Arizona and Utah. They saw damages the last year from different housing structures, roadways starting to crack, to warp, to bend and lift. That's a concern in different basins like the Pacific Northwest and the UK as well. We're starting to see those same impacts across the Middle East. Major concerns for structural integrity of pipelines as well. When you look at some of the different impacts, you can see all of the different sectors and their risks from heat. So we are expecting for this to be one of the hottest years on record, if not the hottest year on record. We're well above average across the board right now, both for surfaces and for ocean. What we're looking at as major threats is going to be even our nuclear power plants. They have their own reservoir systems, but they purchase wastewater. The less water available at the surface and the more hazardous it is to pull our groundwater from below, the more these are going to be threats across every sector as far as energy is concerned and all of the dependencies associated with it. So you can see the graphics there. Power lines are going to sag this year. It's going to get so hot. And then with that, when they sway from those stronger winds, the capability of wildfire ignitions are going to go up. We're going to see more red flag warnings across every state out west. That's going to be a concern for public safety power shutoffs, especially. Those are on the rise already, and it hasn't even fully set in with the heat dome over there yet. Looking at transportation impacts, pretty widespread across the board. Globally right now, we're seeing threats of this. India's already had their first heat dome of the year. Temperatures over 108 degrees persisting for a week. We also had humidity levels there at 75% or greater. That's incredibly hot and humid for that region. They ended up shutting down operations for multiple power plants. They shut down transportation in a couple of different sectors due to the air quality in that region as well. So you're going to continue to see railways are going to warp out. The darker the railway, the more it's going to warp. Same thing with any other platform, roadways, runways that are darker. Anything that takes on a darker color will take on a higher heat content, and subsequently that material is more likely to warp, bend, or break. That's also going to impact turbulence on flights. So you're going to notice that cargo shipments are going to go down in the amount that they can transport. The hotter it is, the more turbulence, but also the harder it is to lift off for different aircraft, and helicopters can't fly in certain heat conditions. Your staff are also going to be at risk. This is one of the final slides. You're going to notice that the theft rates are going to go up. They're going to find the facilities that have water if they're in an area that's in a drought restriction. They're more likely, the general public, to try to access your water spigots on the outside. They're more likely to try to steal backup generators. This has already been reported over the last 2 years on a major rise. And then during major storm events, when they know that power outages are out, we've seen more people falsely pretending to be restoration crews to gain access to sites, and that's doing a lot of damage on site, and it's also very hard for insurance companies to keep track of. So to be aware that other people are tracking these same storm events are on the rise, and they're taking advantage of it going forward. So again, just reiterating on the tail end of the presentation that this impacts infrastructure, operations, but also your staffing. They are going to start to get more aggressive. Road rage is going to go up. Workplace violence is likely to go up. Terrorism attacks are also on the rise when it's hotter. So looking at all of these different studies, just to be aware that heart attacks increase and that blood pressure goes up, that allows for a more aggressive population. That's going to carry into your work sites, especially out west. They're getting into hot cars. They're getting off hot trains, hot planes. They're getting into the work environment, or they're not wanting to come into the work environment because of these stressors that are amplifying this out. You're also going to notice that going forward, it's not going to get any better. So if you don't start planning for it now, it's only going to get worse. There's those memes out there that say things like, this is the coolest summer so far, even though it's the record-breaking hottest, or it's going to be the coolest summer going into the future. When you look at precipitation shifts, those are going to start to match. They're going to suck the moisture out of the west where it's hottest, and they're going to deposit it over to the east. Even though you guys need it more, you're going to end up watching it get carried over and cause torrential flooding events out east. So when you start to look at some of those impacts, if you want to know more, you can reach out to me and I'll give you any information that you want on these different studies, on the forecast for the next 10 days, all the bad news you could possibly hope to consume in a short, condensed period of time. I am here for you guys. So pending any questions, that's what I've got for the outlook.
Thank you so much, Sunny. As you were talking and with your dire predictions at the end and everything, I actually had one of my staff message that she's loading her ship for Mars because she's scared of what's happening in the US. I appreciate the breadth of your presentation and how it takes into account the broader picture of what, not only what is going on, but how it's going to impact the rest of us. And so appreciate the slides. Want to remind everyone that these are actually recorded, so you can go back and listen to all of the things and look at the slides that Sunny's presented if you want to utilize them for information going forward, sharing with your other stakeholders in the environment. So we are going to move on to our panel discussion now, which Sunny is also going to participate in. And we also want to encourage questions from the audience. So Steve Oshbaker is on the line so that he can assist in moderating the panel and the discussion with Tim Beach, the Director of Reliability Coordination from RCS in CAISO. Hayden Johnson, the lead functional coordinator with SPP Western RC, and then of course Sunny Westcott, who did our intro and set us up for a good discussion with regard to summer outlook for the Western Interconnection. So I'm going to manage questions from the audience while Steve manages the discussion with the panelists. So I may chime in and interact from time to time. With that warning, I will pass it to Steve to begin the discussion.
So good morning, everyone. Very interesting presentation, Sunny. I think it just exemplifies or magnifies the uniqueness of the West. And I cannot go back and capture all the details you said, but you just listened to your presentation and the extreme weather varying from heat, rain, wind. We'll have those conditions in different locations in the West, and Tim and Hayden having to deal with those in different times, different time zones, different areas of the grid creates the challenges that these guys have. And so one thing to the crowd and the audience today is that you can see we have just reliability coordinators on the call. So some of the questions I'll be asking are going to be very focused towards the reliability coordinator in how we proceed going into this summer and some of the things that they will be doing that they can talk to us about, some of the roles they play. So Tim and Hayden, I guess, based on what we've just heard from Sunny, and maybe any information that you have in additional from your folks in your footprints, the TOPs and the BAs, what sort of concerns do you guys see going into this summer 2024?
I can start, Steve, if you'd like. That's okay.
Sure.
Well, what we just heard from Sunny is, one of the things that I've been hearing from some of the BAs in the Northwest is the potential drought in that area and the impact to water resources that we have. And of course, the West has been very fortunate, for many, many decades, really, to have that strong water-based energy resource for delivery into other parts of the interconnection. So if we start losing that, that's going to, impact a lot of people, many people across the interconnection. And I've heard that, Sunny, I don't think you mentioned if that drought extends into Canada, but I believe British Columbia is part of that as well, right? So, we've heard some concerns from them as well, dependent on the late season snowfall. And I got a recent update on that, but that was something we heard concern about that after the MLK storm that we had, where they did use more water resources than they would typically plan on, but they also were considering that they would get it replenished as well with later snowfall. Some of that snowfall did happen in the southern part of the Pacific Northwest or in California, but I don't think to the extent of the areas we're concerned about. So that's a little bit of a concern. That's always been a concern, and we'll continue to monitor that. Another thing we just heard as well from Sunny is the increased temperatures, right? Extreme temperatures, and what really is almost sounded dystopian there a little bit, but the expanding consequences of that extreme weather. From hitting generation D rates at a greater impact level now than we experienced in the past for longer durations. It seems like in the past, and this is just sort of my gut, we'd have a heat storm, it'd be a 3-day, 4-day event, and typically we get some relief. 2022, we saw a 9-day event, right, across the interconnection. We start building that across interconnection. That just really hits all the things that Sunny was talking about, right down into behavior from the public. So those things are a concern to us. It would be sort of new to us as far as impacting transfer if somebody did something, or there was unrest in that area. So that's a little bit of concern. Of course, fuel delivery. And I don't think Sunny mentioned impact to natural gas pipelines from ambient temperatures. That's something that just sort of I thought about a little bit when she was talking, and we talked about the railways. We've talked about water resource, and we talked about water, delivery of energy across the interconnection. one of those energy delivery systems is our natural gas pipelines in the West. Very important into the Northwest and the Southern California area for fuel to generate energy. So, I'm wondering what extreme temperatures we'll have on those pipelines. So that's something I'm going to make a note of and maybe try to get some information for our summer readiness webinar that happens May 15th. With that, I'll yield to Hayden. So thank you.
I'm Hayden Johnson. And I'll echo a lot of what Tim said, just kind of on the other side of the interconnection. So starting with the hydroelectric generation, obviously that drought region in southwestern Colorado and in New Mexico affects the Colorado River system. The majority of our hydroelectric generation resides on that river system and extends down into Arizona. So the headwaters for that starts in Colorado and goes down into Arizona. So just maintaining an awareness of how that's impacting the levels in all those reservoirs and what that does for the flexibility of operation for those hydroelectric resources is really important, right? They're in key areas in a lot of places, both in Colorado and in Arizona, so they can have impacts to congestion and capacity both. So making sure that we're assessing those impacts and creating resource plans to address those issues, as well as, outage coordination during those hotter times. So when we start to take out transmission assets in those heavily congested corridors, that's obviously going to increase congestion and difficulty in mitigation. So making sure that our outage coordination process is taking that into account and addressing those concerns. I think one thing that we're seeing a lot more of, as it's getting hotter, we're seeing a lot more of behind the meter renewable resources as well as demand response resources, which is aiding in our ability to address those reliability concerns. But when stuff is behind the meter, it's more difficult to forecast. So making sure that, when we're looking at things like load forecasts, especially, that we are accounting for those impacts of the behind the meter assets and making sure that our resource plans reflect that, working with our BAs to reflect that, and communicating adequately across the RC seams as well. And then when we do get into those periods where we have those extended heat times, especially in load pockets is where we see huge impacts. So that southern New Mexico region has a lot of load that's right on the edge of the interconnection. I know Southern California runs into that as well, and just flows through the area serving that load. It has a regional impact that impacts, WEC as a whole. And so making sure that the RC coordination during those timeframes is robust and that we're not taking actions in our area that are harming our neighbors. So just increased communication and coordination is always a concern during those hotter periods. And I think that pretty much covers the main concerns from SPP's perspective.
Great. Thanks, Hayden. Thanks, Tim. Hayden, I guess some of the things that you popped out is the awareness piece that you talked about, and realizing what sort of a day is it going to be in terms of resource planning, congestion management areas, seams issues, maybe I'm thinking. So I kind of leads into my next question that I was thinking about. The coordination piece that you alluded to, not only between you and Tim and the Canadian RCs, but all between you and the TOP and the BAs within your footprint. I know that there's a lot of things that you guys do on a daily basis between coordination calls, but maybe you can speak to a little bit about some of the, like Tim, maybe the blast calls that you do, what kind of things cause you to initiate those calls. And then maybe talk about some of the congestion management tools that you have in place to mitigate those things, and outage coordination, I guess, is a key thing. What sort of involvement do you have there, and how do you coordinate all that with the TOPs and balancing authorities within each of your footprints? I don't know who wants to go first with that. It's
So I'm going to pop in really quick too, and just remind y'all that all the acronyms across all the different things, right? BA, balancing authority is one standardly used, but TO and TOP are not. So transmission owner, transmission operators. But as you speak in your regular lingo, if you can get us in the loop on some of the less known acronyms as you utilize them, that'd be great.
My bad. Thank you, Chris.
No worries.
Yeah,
Yeah, Hayden, I don't know if you want
I
to
can
take
jump
the
in
lead
there.
there.
Sure. So to start off, RC West, Tim's group starts a daily conference call between the RCs, and that happens every single day. So no matter what the system conditions are, that's kind of our last chance as an RC to talk about any concerns, and it covers everything that you just talked about: congestion concerns, capacity concerns, outage coordination concerns, wildfires. You know, the list is endless, and it's really a time for all the RCs in the Western Interconnection to get together every morning and just say, hey, this is what we're dealing with. This is what our potential outlook is. And, you know, if we do need help, we can talk about things like that. How can you guys, you know, is there any assistance we can provide, whatever it is. So that kind of sets the tone for the day. And then depending on system conditions, so if we get into any extreme weather event, SPP has a process called SPP West RC Watch, and we break our balancing authorities and transmission operators into two groups. We have a Rocky Mountain region group, and then we have a Desert Southwest region. And the reason we split them like that is across that Colorado cut plain, the congestion issues and flow issues are regionalized between pretty much our Desert Southwest footprint, which is New Mexico, Arizona, touching California. They seem to experience and mitigate things as a group. And then north of that Colorado border in that Rocky Mountain region, those TOPs seem to mitigate and experience congestion more as a group, from capacity and congestion both. And so we look at those groups separately, and when we see things like 90% of the historical peak loading in that area, it will generate an automatic notification to our RCs that says this region has experienced 90% of its historical peak or is forecasted for 90% of its historical peak. You need to contact all of the balancing authorities and transmission operators and inquire about any potential operational issues that loading is going to bring. And so we'll call all of our impacted entities and say, hey, this is the load value we're seeing for today. Historically, that has caused issues with congestion or capacity. Who has concerns? What does your resource plans look like? Any issues with behind the meter stuff? And it just gives the chance for the balancing authorities and the transmission operators to let us know if they have any concerns, and then we'll address those concerns accordingly with the impacted entities. With that coordination, RC West also does a very similar coordination with our Desert Southwest entities. So we have our own call, but RC West also includes all our entities on their call, and we are involved in that call as well. And we have the same conversations, but those ones span RC lines. And so we're not siloing those conversations to just our balancing authorities or just our transmission operators. It's all the impacted entities in that region. And that starts the work. And if anything's identified, then we escalate through the rest of our processes from there. And as far
Great.
as outage coordination is concerned, Steve, we share all our outage information with RC West, and they share it with us as well. And so when we are planning generation transmission outages, things of that nature, we are assessing their impact, and we're giving them ours as well.
Great. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Hayden. Yeah, Hayden did a great job of explaining the coordination, especially on a daily basis. The only thing I'll change, from the RC West side is that we split our regions into North RC West North and South. The South is California and the Southwest, like Hayden described. And then the North is Pacific Northwest area, Montana, Idaho included. So that's how we handle that. One of the things we do now is we get a 7-day forecast, and if we start seeing extreme weather coming in a forecast, we'll start initiating conversations with the RC or TOP and BA leadership. Start talking about making sure they're seeing the weather coming, making sure there's any concerns that are identified as early as possible, so we can do that. And then as we get closer to it, if the forecast does develop or the weather does develop as forecasted, we'll start initiating daily calls with the RCs and the RCs on shift and the TOPs and BAs on shift as well. And those take place very early in the morning, but it's a chance for each BA and TOP to talk about, any concerns they have, anything that's maybe forecasted, if they're looking potential an EEA during the week, during the day, or if they're one bad thing away from an EEA. That's a good time for them to mention that, and we can start acting on those and start being aware of having a heightened awareness around trap generation that's trapped behind a transmission constraint or other things like that. So very, very, very similar to what SPPRC does. One of the things we're going to implement this year, and hopefully we're going to do this in June sometime, is we're going to initiate an RC West status indicator. So as we start seeing these weather conditions develop 7 days out, we may set our status indicator to a condition of yellow, which means we see an emergency condition, we're monitoring it, and then there'll be some communications that's generated from that. So that's coming in the near future. That'll be available just to the RC West customers, and it'll be posted as part of our RC daily report that goes out every day. So I'm not sure if Hayden mentioned that, but RC West at least does issue an RC daily report where we look at the forecasted load. We look at the IRL limits that are set for the day, whether they're derated due to a scheduled outage or other condition. We have our major transmission line outages in there. We have our major generation outages in there. We have a weather forecast in there, and any other concerns can be noted as well. That gets shipped out every day and goes to the operators. And it's posted on our RC portal for any of our RC members to look at any time. So that gives them a good view of the day. That happens 365 days a year for us.
Hey, super stuff from all of you. And just before I kind of check with Chris on what we might have from the audience, EEA, Energy Emergency Alert, for those on the call that are not familiar with that. And there's 3 levels of that Energy Emergency Alert. And now we have even a new term in the West that's called the Emergency Alert Watch. So Chris, and then great stuff, you guys. You've actually answered several other questions. The proactiveness, I'm glad you did that. I was going to ask about that. But Chris, have we got questions online that we might take a minute here?
We do. We have several, and I appreciate you explaining the EEA to the crowd, because we have a largely policymaker crowd on these calls, and I'm not sure that the majority of them are familiar with what EEAs are. And essentially, and Steve, you can correct me where I state this wrong, but at a high level, EEAs are utilized by the BAs to identify critical states that they are in, essentially, so that it allows their neighbors to know when they might be in a position to need assistance. Is that a high level? Is that about right?
I think it is. It's a process where there's 3 different steps, and it's basically saying that the balancing authority is becoming relatively tight on resources. Yeah. They're approaching and using their contingency reserves to cover load, and they're in a position where they may have to start to shed in non-firm load, eventually get to the point where they could be shedding firm load, and they're just giving those advanced notifications. And the RC is the one that actually executes that for the BA. But I think you did. That's a good analogy. Yeah.
It's a way the BAs communicate with one another in tight times. So we have several questions online, and I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to ask Sunny to go first, and then I would love for Tim and Hayden to pair onto that. The question is, solar power tends to be impacted by wildfires, and wind generation produces less in drought years, according to a Stanford study. Given Sunny's forecast, are we anticipating reduced solar and wind generation this summer? And if so, how much? And then I have a couple of follow-ups to that one. But Sunny, do you want to begin? Do you have that information?
I will say that given that most of the wildfires haven't fully begun to kick off, that smoke forecasting, can't be done. The vast majority of wildfires being human ignited, that makes it a lot more difficult. Canada, on the other hand, already being on fire, especially across their oil sands. It's a pretty notable fire season for various areas. Areas which saw drought over the last year and didn't see snowpack are going to be the greatest at risk. But the shift in the winds and the wind intensity is really going to dictate where that smoke falls. And that smoke is the reason that that's an impact on solar, is the amount of debris that covers it. Dust storms are going to be notably worse out west this year than they have been in the last couple of years, replicating closer to 2017 and 2019 in size and intensity. So those events being a lot more localized and a lot more isolated to the particular kickoff of the event. not something that can be forecasted until it begins, because you have to isolate your hotspot areas and your general population. I know a lot has gone out in the way of trying to get the public more aware of what it is that they contribute to the wildfire seasons as a whole. And I know that our energy sector has been listed pretty frequently recently in different news pockets for different states for contributing to wildfire activity. So depending on your load and the intensity of heat, that heat dome starts to kick off at the end of May, that's going to be a major concern out west for once it starts. Highlighting ahead of time, not as helpful, saying that solar isn't going to produce as much because of the smoke. The vast majority of solar, if you're asking for solar as an entirety of an industry, is probably going to do a lot better because there will be longer periods under direct sunlight. So they'll benefit from that. They don't lose load under certain heat thresholds, which most of the areas will get enough of the downslope winds overnight to cool down. It'll just be keeping them cool enough for them to bring in the amount of energy that they need to bring in. Wind on the other side, certain areas like New Mexico and Texas, which are going to have greater temperature disparity between the top of the mountains and the bottom of the valley, they're going to see greater downsloping winds. The downside is they don't have nearly as much in the way of wind transmission systems established as places like Wyoming does. Wyoming looking at finalizing out that wind transmission line from Wyoming to California, that's a major offset that's in the future to come. So there's definitely something to be said about different regions having a leg up on this year's weather event based off of where they sit in the basin of bad. Not one type of energy provision is really going to supersede the rest. They'll all take a hit from different things. The drought and evapotranspiration on hydroelectric, the heat and the winds and the storms on transmission lines, those same things on solar, the hail damage on and the droughts and stagnant air advisories on the wind. There is something to be said for each one of them. Really, underground energy generation systems like geothermal are the only ones that are immune, but you still have to transmit the energy from point A to point B. So even if, let's say, the solar panels didn't take damage, if your substations or your transmission lines do, then it didn't matter in that instance because you weren't able to make the most use of it. So it's hard to say one's going to do better this early in the season because of that. You can highlight the threats, though, and say, we know that major solar fields are here. We know that winds and fire rates are likely to increase. Utilizing, I highly recommend the evaporative, the EDDI. If you Google EDDI NOAA, it'll pull up that page. You can go back and look at how much it's changed week by week, month by month, season by season, and you can see how much your vegetation is taking a hit. That or the GRACE satellite imagery provided by NASA, both are really good tools that'll help you isolate what areas are going to be at greater need from especially wildfire and drought impacts.
Okay. Thanks, Sunny. For Tim and Hayden in particular, the second portion of this question is specific to the RCs, and it's how are the RCs and operational entities accounting for weather changes in their seasonal planning? And part of the question says, are they still using historical weather data, or are they using new forecasting information for the coming months? And I think that references some of Sunny's preliminary remarks where she said it's harder to predict and plan for. How are the RCs accounting for that?
Speak for California ISOBA, in fact, in this regard. They do take into account, past models. They look at several models of weather forecasting, smoke, wind, and all those things, and they also generate a pretty good forecast for the potential impacts of the day. They have the optimum, what they think is going to happen, and then they put confidence bands around that solar generation, for example. So if there's smoke impacting or cloud impacting solar generation, for example, they say, well, if we miss it, it's not going to be any more than this on one side or any less than this on the other side. So they've had quite a bit of development in that area, and we've learned quite a bit over the years on it, and I believe they've gotten pretty good at it. Now, one of the things that Sunny touched on at the end here, I just want to sort of get on my soapbox a little bit, is the use of satellites. Steve had me participate in a University of Wisconsin energy policy as a panelist at NCAR in Colorado, the National Atmospheric Research National Lab. I can't remember exactly what the name of it is, but one of the things we saw was a lot of the work that's going on in the research field as far as using satellites for developing things like, how much fuel is on the ground if you have a fire, and how can we predict it if that fire does ignite there, can we predict how long, what the travel time is it to a transmission line corridor, which could impact transfer, right? So that's something that's developing. Every chance I get a chance to talk about it and encourage and support of that, I do that. So thank you, Sonny, for that. But yeah, so that's, I think, in the BA sense, we've really developed quite a bit. An example of that is the eclipse that we just recently had, right, in April, right? Where we had an eclipse, it wasn't sure what the weather is going to be like. We forecasted a clear day impact versus a partial cloudy day, which is what sort of developed during it. And we were able to manage those ramps in and out of that eclipse pretty efficiently. Now it is at a lower load period than what we'd expect, during a summer's heat wave, but it does sort of demonstrate the ability of the forecasting ability to protect those loads and then project if you are going to have a problem on the hottest day of the year. And if you have a big storm or big wildfire generates a lot of smoke over a solar facility, what that impact is going to be. And do you have to react to it, or do you have to take emergency steps for it? So I think that's a very good demonstration of what they can do today as far as forecasting.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Hayden, did you have anything you wanted to add to that on behalf of SPP?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I forgot to mention in the previous conversation was we do have an on-staff meteorologist that does a lot of resource planning for our Eastern BA, and he works under a team called the Uncertainty Response Team. And I want to key off something Sunny said. She said a lot of these things are really hard to forecast, right? So when you can forecast stuff extremely accurately, it's pretty easy to respond from a reliability and resource planning perspective. It's those moments where you have unprecedented events that's straight outside of those forecasts. And so trying to assess the potential for uncertainty and times when there's an increased risk of uncertainty in generation outages, load, transmission outages, all those things, and collectively planning to address that uncertainty is something that SPP pursues pretty intensely on our east side, and we're trying to expand that into the Western Interconnection. It's a little more difficult because we don't do unit commitment in the Western Interconnection, so that's a big part of our eastern footprint. We are actually the ones that do the resource planning for our balancing authority, and that's what Tim was mentioning. But helping our balancing authorities to understand what, when there is uncertainty and what those impacts look like, and a lot of that does come from looking in the past and looking at those unprecedented events from historical data and learning from those events and applying it to future conditions. So that is something we do try to do really proactively. Our meteorologist on staff does do the 7-day outlook, and as those conditions get closer to real time, those forecasts get more and more accurate. The eclipse is a great example that Tim brought up. We were communicating with our balancing authorities going into that event, and the closer you get to those events, the better data that you have, and the more accurate decisions that you can make based on that decision. So I think that forward-looking analysis is a big part of resource planning in the West now, and we try to be as proactive as we can and as transparent as we can with all the information that we have available to us to give that to our BAs and our TOPs.
Thanks, Hayden. I think you just gave a new bullet to a lot of people who are looking to develop the markets in the West. The ability to manage it better and have the resources. I have one other question that didn't come in with that same path. Comes from one of our friends in the Northwest and says, we are seeing a big change. This is specific for our RC partners on the line. We're seeing a big change in northbound flows up to the Northwest that are causing new overload issues. These paths have historically been southbound and are not qualified for unscheduled flow procedures. Is there anything as a regional entity that you can do to support reducing unscheduled flows?
That's a great question. We are definitely seeing changes in flow patterns. So, one of the, like I discussed earlier, one of the traditional transfers was northwest to south, right? Northwest, Pacific Northwest with all its rich water resources down into California or Arizona, New Mexico, that type of thing. But we've seen changes there, right? So we've seen that for example, during the MLK weekend storm, we had maximum transfer south to north. across the California-Oregon border. So that's really that's a change, and we're really looking and examining what our limits are for those. We've had traditional limits there, and we know those are reliable. We're wondering if we have a greater limit, we can transfer more. So we're looking to see what that boundary is. As far as unscheduled flow, right now we are sort of stuck with the unscheduled flow process. And then the BAs or TOPs submitting those paths for qualifications. That's our tool to manage those currently. However, saying that, there is some task forces going on to try to determine if there's other ways we can use the schedules that are used in the UFMP are identified in that for curtailment in the future. So to relieve those overloads that we're seeing at times. So that's definitely a recognized issue by both RCs, in fact, and all the BAs and TOPs in that area. We are seeing a number of seam issues that are cropping up because of unaccounted for flow, and we're trying to look for solutions to do that. I don't have a hard answer for you on that, but other than the traditional path, that's something we're examining.
Okay. Not sure. Hayden, I don't want to jump past you, but SPP is not in the same region, maybe to deal with the same things, but do you run into any of that within your eastern region?
Yeah, so as Tim mentioned, historically congested paths are less congested just because of resource development in those areas. And so we've seen a change in pattern through our footprint. I think the thing that we focus on is when we see those heavy south to north biases in California, WEC as a whole, just because of the dynamic of the system, there's load centers that are really far away from generation and a lot of space in between. So when there's problems or congestion issues in California, we experience changes in flows on our side too. And I think what that's led to is just one thing I want to mention under this topic is we do a lot of work with RC West. When we do experience those conditions where we do have congestion across the seams or they need help managing that interface and they think that our resources can help them do that, they reach out to us, we reach out to them. If it requires support staff communication, the development of an op guide, whatever it may be to address those more severe reliability concerns, we work with RC West really closely all the time and vice versa. And I think that has produced a good result for both of the RCs.
Good to hear.
Yeah,
I'm going to take
I
it back to Steve.
Yeah, I think thanks to the folks online, they've made my job easy. A number of my questions I've already had all queue were about ready to ask, particularly in this area of the transformation of the grid and how we're seeing non-traditional flow patterns and how we're dealing with those. And I think I think it's safe to say that we've got some internal stakeholder groups that are looking at the existing congestion management tools that we have to deal with particularly qualified paths, but we're looking to expanding that tool to be able to provide congestion management on more than just the qualified tools and probably looking at addressing these changing flow patterns. So there are some things I think that are happening, but I think that in general, I guess one question that I might ask both Hayden and Tim is the PSPS question that Sonny alluded to. And as we're hearing more and more happening, and Hayden, you guys just recently experienced actually the first time maybe in Colorado area that they had to do some customer interruptions because of high winds and things. I know that a lot of the PSPS is involved around the distribution level where you guys don't really have a lot of control management or oversight or authority of, but there are times maybe when they will be de-energizing BES facilities. Any thoughts there on how you're informed of those? What sort of information do you get on those? How does that factor into your role on the grid? Maybe just a few minutes left here. We can expound on that just a little. I know that's a hot topic across the grid now as PSPS.
Sure, thank you. I can expand on that a little bit and let Hayden talk about his Colorado experience. We've been dealing with PSPSs for quite a while in California. We've seen an expansion of those into other areas in the Northwest as well. Typically what happens is we'll get several days in advance, there'll be a weather forecast that generates concern about a PSPS event. The TOPs will inform us that these lines are under consideration for being de-energized if a PSPS event develops. And when it's a long ways out, there's usually a lot of lines in those. We typically start using those in our OPA analysis, making sure that we're accounting for those being out of service to make sure we identify any congestion or capacity or transfer issues as they develop. As we get closer to the actual day of the forecast at PSPS, typically those line outages that are potentially impacted will shrink dramatically. And to the point now that really we haven't had any regional issues develop because of PSPS. It's typically a local load area pocket that's an issue. And any outages that have occurred hasn't been occurred because of loss of the ability to transfer energy into a load pocket. It's been rather due to the distribution or the subtransmission in those load pockets. So that's our experience to date. Will that maintain in the future? You know, I'm not sure. I sure hope so. But our experience has been relatively pretty good. And the utilities, I will say, that have gotten very good at their PSPS plans and how they're implemented, in particular how they impact the transmission system. With
Thanks,
that,
Tim.
Hayden, I'll let you talk to as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd reiterate everything that Tim just said. I think that was a pretty good overview of how to respond. I think the biggest one that we get concerned with is when fires maybe not remove the facilities from service, but when it creates an N-2 condition. So, you know, they remain in, but you got smoke or a fire that potentially has the ability to impact multiple facilities simultaneously. And then we have to make the decision from the RC side or maybe the TOP side on what things we're going to consider as a single contingency event. Those things are difficult to manage in real time, and we've done a really good job. Like Tim said, we've never had an issue doing that, but it's always a concern, right? If you get a couple 345 lines, 500 kV lines that are now being considered as a single contingency instead of an N-1, that can be difficult to manage. And being as proactive as you possibly can on the front end is obviously going to make that easier to deal with. So again, it's just constant communication with the transmission operator, studying those outages as quickly as possible, and trying to ascertain what the impact of those outages would be prior to them taking place.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in for a closeout question because we are running low on time. I knew this hour would go quickly. If you, for each of you, and if we start at the top of my screen, that'll be Sunny, Hayden, and then Tim last. If you had one piece of advice that you could provide policymakers on what to watch for with regard to this summer, one thing that you want them to look at and pay attention to, what would be that one thing that you would pick to have them pay that leads to the highest priority in your mind? Sunny?
The sudden addition of cooling centers, typically without really paying attention to it. These cooling centers that are opting to take on higher loads are running at higher rates. They're running longer through the night, and more are volunteering for it because of the benefits. So you can end up with some of these sites being in the typical plan for a mall, for example, closing at 6 on Sundays, maybe now not closing until 11 to 12. Some of these sites might be operating overnight. The libraries, bigger facilities that can hold more people, because that's the push. When HVAC systems go out because of these extreme temperatures, which they will, propane tanks will also start to explode in some of these temperatures. People will need places to go to cool down, and you're going to see that those larger facilities, without annotating to anybody, are going to start operating longer through the night, more pull on the grid through the night because of that. People running their HVACs overnight through the entire home system is also going to be a major concern. Larger homes, larger pulls, all of these increased needs at a time in which, you know, you're already going to be struggling. The overnight loads are going to start to really rise up, but it's going to be those cooling centers adding on without notification that I worry about personally, because there's such a big push that it's a voluntary system, which means that they can jump on at any point.
That is great insight. Thank you, Sunny. Hayden?
I think we touched on it earlier, but that interconnection-wide congestion management process, having a very defined and clear means of effectively mitigating congestion on an interconnection level, identifying the source of the congestion, and then having the tools to change generation flows quickly is really important. And Tim spoke to it. There is a huge effort in the Western Interconnection from every entity involved to try to get that off the ground. That to me will do great things for congestion management in the Western Interconnection. And also what it does is it regionally allows each RC and each participant to look at the West as one whole unit, right? And so, looking at things like transmission planning and all that, it has huge downstream impacts. So I think that interconnection-wide congestion management is a big takeaway and would add a lot of benefit.
Thanks, Hayden. I know we constantly at WEC are talking about the Western Interconnection as one synchronous machine. So the more we coordinate and collaborate with one another, I think you're absolutely right, the better off we are. So Tim, you get the last word, the one piece of advice that you would give for this summer.
So I won't repeat Sonny or Hayden, but those are great points that they both made. So thank you for that. But my last word is going to be, if the TOPs and BAs, I'm going to have two words here, two things to say. One for the TOPs and BAs on the phone, and then one for the regulators or policymakers that might be on there as well. For the TOPs and BAs, if you see trouble, make sure you let your RC know about it. The farther in advance we have, the more proactive we are, the better we can address those and potentially mitigate them before they become an emergency. So I always say, the best way to prevent an emergency is to stop it from happening to begin with. So, or to mitigate it. So the second one is to the policymakers, the regulatories. The EAs will get a lot of attention from people, and a lot of times it can be negative. But I want to, put forth, it's good that you're being told these things, because in EA Watch and EA1 in particular, that means your balancing authorities are taking action. They do see their forecasts. They are communicating to an interconnection that they are in a full resource condition. Now, many BAs go through the EA procedures without shedding firm load. We've had one case of firm load shed from an EA here, 3 here in the last 4 years. So typically once we hit those steps, that means we're managing the problem. So that's what I'm concerned. That's one thing I want to really have you take back is that, your RCs and your TOPs and BAs and the RC to RC are all working together to solve these problems. And the EA Watch in particular is a very strong proactive device that we use for preventing those emergencies from escalating. So with that, I'll say thank you. Thank you all.
That's a really great point, Tim. I think it's really important to note that, because some of the people on the call, I think, probably have never heard of an EEA. An EEA, it is an energy emergency alert, and it's a tool that we use to help manage the reliability of the system. And it's a really effective tool. I think that we have at least found in the Western Interconnection that it has proven to be a very effective tool for us to communicate with one another through those EEAs. So I want to thank Tim and Hayden and Sonny. I think you all are gems for us to be able to have to discuss the summer outlook and what the summer is going to look like. This was intended to be kind of a preliminary conversation. As Tim pitched earlier, the CAISO will have its summer outlook. There are other discussions that occur within the interconnection, all important. So hopefully we kicked it off well for a summer outlook. And Steve Ashbaker is our resident expert on a lot of these matters, which is why he was the perfect moderator for this panel. So I want to thank him for his participation as well. And I will kick it back to Travis to close us out.
Good deal. Chris, thank you for walking through the audience questions. And again, want to thank Tim Beach, Hayden Johnson, and Sonny Westcott for taking time out of your very busy schedules to share with us. And I echo the thanks, Steve Ashbaker. Appreciate you leading us through those questions. Next month, we will be back and we'll be taking a more analytical look at the summer ahead. And we'll be having a discussion about WEC's summer assessment of resource adequacy for the West. So hope you can join us. Mark your calendars. It will be June 6th from 11 a.m. till noon Mountain Time. So again, I appreciate you all joining us this morning. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Everyone.
Thanks so much.